June 1944, the skies above Saipan. The air tasted of salt and aviation fuel, thick and acrid in the lungs, mingling with the metallic tang of fear that no pilot would ever admit to feeling. The sun hung low over the Pacific, turning the ocean into a sheet of hammered copper, blinding and indifferent, as it had been for 1,000 years before men brought their machines to die above it. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto pulled his goggles down and felt the rubber seal press against his sweat-soaked skin, the Mitsubishi Zero beneath him vibrating with a frequency he knew better than his own heartbeat. Around him, 11 other fighters formed a loose formation, their wings catching the light like the scales of some ancient creature, beautiful and terrible, hunting. They had been told the Americans were coming. They had been told many things. That the enemy were demons without honor, that they tortured prisoners for sport, that they knew nothing of Bushido, of sacrifice, of the sacred duty that transformed a man into something more than flesh and bone. Yamamoto had believed these things the way a child believes in the shape of clouds, completely and without question, because the alternative was a sky without form, a war without meaning. He was 23 years old. He had been fighting for 2 years. He could no longer remember clearly what peace felt like, only that it existed somewhere behind him, in a country he protected, but could no longer quite picture, like trying to recall the face of someone you loved from a photograph that had been left too long in the sun. The radio crackled. Enemy formation spotted. Bearing 270. Angels 12. His commander's voice was steady, almost bored, as if announcing the weather. Yamamoto adjusted his grip on the control stick, felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that began in his chest and spread outward like cold water, sharpening everything, making the world crystalline and immediate. This was what he had trained for. This is what gave his life architecture and purpose. The hunt, the fight. The moment when all doubt dissolved into action, and a man became pure intention, pure will. They spotted the American bombers 8 minutes later, a formation of B-24 Liberators, heavy and graceless, lumbering through the sky like pregnant whales, their aluminum bodies flashing in the sun. Yamamoto felt a familiar contempt rise in his throat. These machines represented everything wrong about American warfare, about American thinking, the belief that mass and metal could substitute for spirit, that quantity could overwhelm quality, that men who flew in comfort and safety, surrounded by armor and guns and other men, could ever understand what it meant to truly fight. A Zero carried almost no armor. A Zero trusted in speed and maneuverability and the skill of its pilot. A Zero asked a man to be worthy of it. The attack came fast and brutal, the way all aerial combat came. The sky suddenly full of tracer rounds that looked like red beads on an invisible string. The sound of engines screaming, the smell of cordite and hot metal. Yamamoto dove on the trailing bomber, lined up his shot with the precision of a surgeon, felt the Zero shudder as the gun spoke. He watched his rounds stitch across the Liberator's fuselage, saw pieces of metal tear away and spin into the slipstream, saw the rear turret go silent. He pulled up hard, the G-forces pressing him into his seat, the blood draining from his head, the world narrowing to a tunnel. This was the dance. This was where he lived. 2 of the bombers went down. He watched them spiral earthward, trailing smoke like black ribbons, and felt nothing. Or rather, he felt what he had been taught to feel, satisfaction at duty fulfilled, at the Emperor's enemies falling from the sky like wingless birds. But beneath that, something else stirred, something he pushed down quickly, the way a man swallows bile. It was the beginning of a question he did not want to ask. The 3rd bomber they caught was different. It had taken heavy damage, was losing altitude, trying to make it back to the sea. Yamamoto and 2 others pursued it not out of necessity, but out of thoroughness, out of the instinct to finish what had been started. They overtook it easily, sharks circling something dying.
and as Yamamoto pulled alongside to deliver the final burst, he saw through the shattered cockpit glass the face of the pilot, a young man, younger than himself perhaps, his eyes wide and his hands moving across the controls with the desperate precision of someone trying to land a plane that no longer wanted to fly. For just a moment, their eyes met. For just a moment, Yamamoto saw not a demon, but a man, terrified and determined and human. And the moment passed, and he fired, and the bomber dropped away trailing fire, and that was that. They landed back at base as the sun was beginning its descent, the sky going purple and gold, the tropical heat radiating up from the tarmac in waves that made the air shimmer like water. Yamamoto climbed from his cockpit with legs that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the after-effects of adrenaline, from 3 hours of sustained tension. His crew chief was smiling, congratulating him on the confirmed kill, the second bomber. 2. He had shot down 2 American aircraft. He should have felt pride. He felt instead a kind of hollowness, as if something had been scooped out of him and replaced with air. That night he could not sleep. He lay on his bunk in the stifling heat of the barracks, listening to the other pilots breathe and snore and occasionally cry out in their dreams, and he thought about the face he had seen through the cockpit glass. He wondered if the man had died on impact or if he had burned. He wondered if it mattered. He wondered why he was wondering. The next morning brought orders. There had been a second attack, early, before dawn. American fighters had surprised a formation of Japanese bombers returning from a night raid. The result had been catastrophic. 7 bombers lost, 49 men. The wreckage had come down on the northern end of the island, in a valley that the Americans had captured 3 weeks earlier. The bodies needed to be recovered. The honor of the dead needed to be preserved. A reconnaissance team was being assembled. Yamamoto was selected because he knew the terrain, because he was reliable, because someone had to go. They left at first light, a small patrol of 8 men, moving through jungle that was still wet with morning dew, the vegetation so thick it felt like moving through green water. The insects were already awake, a constant high-pitched whine that burrowed into the skull. The heat came with the sun, oppressive and total, turning their uniforms dark with sweat. They moved quietly, carefully, knowing the Americans controlled this area, knowing that at any moment they might walk into an ambush, into a burst of gunfire that would end everything before they even understood what was happening.
They found the first crash site after 2 hours of walking. The bomber had come down hard, nose first, the impact driving it into the soft earth like a stake. The tail section was nearly vertical, pointing at the sky like an accusation. The ground around it was scorched black, and the smell hit them from 50 meters away. Burned metal and burned rubber and burned meat, a smell that had no comparison in civilian life, a smell that told the lizard brains something terrible had happened here and to run away from this place where men had been transformed into smoke and carbon. But it was not the wreckage that made Yamamoto stop. It was the men standing around it. There were perhaps 20 of them, American soldiers, and with them a smaller group of men in different uniforms, darker, more ragged. Prisoners. American prisoners of war. They had been put to work clearing the site, gathering what remained of the dead, and they were doing this under guard, under the watch of soldiers with rifles. But what struck Yamamoto was not their captivity, but their bearing. They moved with purpose, with something that looked almost like reverence. They were careful with the remains they collected. They handled them the way one might handle something sacred. The patrol stayed hidden in the tree line, watching, not daring to move closer, not daring to reveal themselves. Yamamoto lay on his stomach in the wet undergrowth and watched through binoculars. His hands steady, but his heart hammering against his ribs like something trying to escape. He watched the American POWs, these men who should have been broken, should have been animals, working in the sun to gather the dead of their enemy. And then he saw something that made his breath stop in his throat.
One of the prisoners, a tall man with dark hair and hollowed cheeks, had found a body, or what remained of a body. It was identifiable as human only by context, by the uniform fragments that clung to it. The prisoner knelt beside it carefully and began to wrap it in a piece of canvas. He worked slowly, methodically, and when he was finished he stood, the wrapped remains in his arms, and he did something that made no sense, that violated everything Yamamoto had been taught about the enemy, about the Americans, about the nature of this war. He saluted. Not casually, not perfunctorily, he came to attention, there in the mud and ash and wreckage, under the tropical sun, and he rendered a full military salute to the remains of a Japanese airman, to the enemy who would have killed him without hesitation, who had probably tried to kill him or his friends or his brothers 100 times. And he held that salute for a long moment, his face expressionless, his bearing perfect, and then he lowered his hand and carried the remains to where the other wrapped bodies were being laid in a row. Yamamoto felt something crack inside his chest. He watched as this was repeated again and again. The POWs found the dead and treated them with a respect that seemed to come not from orders but from some internal conviction, some code that they carried with them even into captivity, even into degradation, even in the presence of their captors. They worked in the heat until their uniforms were black with sweat, until their hands were blistered and bleeding, and they handled the enemy dead with the same care they would have shown their own. And when a body was placed in the row, when it was positioned just so, they stopped, they straightened, and they saluted. The Japanese among the patrol watched this in silence. No one spoke. No one seemed to know what to say. They had expected desecration, perhaps. They had expected carelessness. They had been taught that the Americans had no concept of honor, no respect for the dead, no understanding of what made a man worthy of remembrance. They had been taught that the enemy were barely human, driven by base instincts, by greed and cowardice, and a soft decadence that made them dangerous in numbers but contemptible in spirit. But these men were not contemptible. These men were acting according to a code as rigid and demanding as Bushido, according to principles that required them to honor even those who had tried to kill them, even those who might yet kill them if given the chance. They were demonstrating a form of discipline that had nothing to do with orders or punishment, and everything to do with who they were, with what they believed a man should be, even when no one was watching, even when the easier path would have been to show contempt. Yamamoto lowered the binoculars. His hands were shaking now. He looked at the man next to him, Corporal Tanaka, and saw his own confusion reflected there. They did not speak. The patrol withdrew as quietly as they had come, melting back into the jungle, leaving the Americans to their work, leaving the dead to the honor they were being given by men who should have hated them.
That night, back at base, Yamamoto sat alone outside the barracks and smoked cigarettes he did not want, staring at stars he could not name. He kept seeing that salute. He kept seeing the careful way the prisoners had handled the remains, the deliberate gentleness, the refusal to allow death to strip dignity from those who had fallen. He tried to reconcile what he had seen with what he had been taught, tried to fit this new information into the framework of understanding that had carried him through 2 years of war, and found that it would not fit. The pieces did not match. The story he had been telling himself about this war, about the enemy, about the righteousness of his cause, it had developed cracks, and through those cracks a terrible light was beginning to shine. If the Americans were honorable, if they respected the dead, if they maintained discipline and dignity even in captivity, then what did that make him? What did that make the cause he fought for? He had killed Americans. He had killed them from the sky, quickly and efficiently, and he had felt satisfaction because he believed he was destroying something contemptible, something that needed to be destroyed. But if they were not contemptible, if they were men of honor operating according to their own code, their own understanding of duty and respect and the proper conduct of warriors,
Then what had he been doing? What had any of them been doing? The propaganda said the Americans were soft, that they valued their own lives too much to fight with true commitment, that they would break when faced with the spirit and determination of Japanese warriors. But Yamamoto had seen them fight. He had seen them fly into withering fire to complete their missions. He had seen them go down and not break formation. He had seen them die with the same courage and fear and determination that he had seen in his own comrades. And now he had seen their prisoners, men who had every reason to hate, men who had been beaten and starved and degraded, still acting with a grace and discipline that spoke of something unbreakable in the human spirit, something that captivity could not touch. He thought about the face he had seen through the cockpit glass. He wondered if that pilot had been like the prisoners he had watched today, if beneath the enemy uniform and the enemy language and the enemy cause, there had been a man who believed in honor, who treated others with respect, who maintained his dignity even when facing death. He wondered if he had killed someone who, in another world, in another time, he might have called friend. The question was unbearable. Yamamoto crushed out his cigarette and went inside and lay in the darkness and did not sleep. Around him the other pilots breathed and dreamed and did not know that something fundamental had shifted, that one of their number had been exposed to an idea more dangerous than any enemy fire, the idea that the enemy was human, fully and completely human, and that this war was not a simple story of good against evil, but something far more complicated, far more tragic, far more terrible.
In the days that followed, Yamamoto continued to fly. He continued to hunt American aircraft, continued to engage in combat, continued to do his duty as he understood it. But something had changed in the way he pulled the trigger. In the split second between target acquisition and firing, there was a hesitation now, not enough to make him ineffective, not enough to endanger himself or his wingmen, but enough to notice, enough to feel. It was as if every time he lined up a shot he saw not a target but a man, not a machine but a person inside the machine, someone with a face and a name, and people who loved him and reasons for fighting that made sense to him the way Yamamoto's reasons made sense to Yamamoto. The war did not care about his crisis of conscience. The war continued with its own momentum, with its own terrible logic. More Americans came. More bombers filled the sky. More men died on both sides, falling into the ocean or the jungle or the volcanic ash of contested islands. And the sun rose and set, and the tide came in and went out, and the great machinery of violence ground forward, indifferent to the moral struggles of individual soldiers who had started to question whether their enemies deserved to die. 3 weeks after witnessing the scene at the crash site, Yamamoto's squadron was scrambled to intercept another American formation. The engagement was brief and chaotic, a swirling dogfight that lasted maybe 10 minutes. And in the middle of it, Yamamoto found himself on the tail of an American fighter, a Hellcat. And he had the shot, had it perfectly, the enemy plane centered in his gun sight, the range ideal, everything aligned. His fever tightened on the trigger, and in that moment, he saw the pilot's head visible through the canopy glass, saw the man flying the plane, and something in him refused. Not consciously, not as a decision. His finger simply would not complete the action. The moment stretched, became eternal, became impossible, and then the Hellcat broke hard left and dove, and the opportunity was gone, and Yamamoto pulled up and away, and his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the control stick. He did not tell anyone. He flew the rest of the mission on autopilot, his mind somewhere else, somewhere far away. He landed, he went through the debriefing, he reported his ammunition expenditure and his observations, and no one noticed that he had failed to fire when he should have fired, that he had let an enemy escape when a month ago he would have killed without thinking. No one noticed because no one was looking for it, because they assumed all pilots were still operating according to the old understanding, the old certainty, the old hate. That night, he walked down to the beach, away from the base, and stood at the edge of the water and watched the moon rise over the Pacific. The ocean was dark and vast,
and indifferent. And somewhere out there, on carriers and islands and submarines, thousands of American sailors and Marines and airmen were preparing for tomorrow, checking their weapons, writing letters home, joking with their friends, doing all the things that soldiers do before battle. And they were doing it with the same dedication and fear and courage that Japanese soldiers brought to their preparations. They were human. They were fully, completely, undeniably human. And acknowledging that truth meant acknowledging something else, something that sat in Yamamoto's stomach like a stone. That this war, which had seemed so necessary and righteous and clear, was a tragedy in which good men on both sides were killing other good men because history and politics and the machinations of empires had decided that they must. There was no comfort in this realization. There was no peace in it. It did not make him want to stop fighting. He was still bound by duty, by loyalty to his squadron and his country, by the knowledge that not fighting would accomplish nothing except his own death and the death of those who relied on him. But he hollowed out the meaning of his fighting, transformed it into a crusade, into mere survival, from an act of righteousness into an act of terrible necessity. He would continue. He would fly and fight and probably die in the service of the emperor. But he would do so knowing that the men he killed were not demons or animals or barbarians, but warriors like himself, trying to survive, trying to do their duty, trying to maintain their honor in a world that seemed designed to strip it away.
The war ended for Yamamoto on a bright morning in August, when the news came of something that had happened at Hiroshima, something that no one quite understood or could explain, something that had killed 100,000 people in an instant and promised to kill 100,000 more. The details were confused, contradictory, impossible to believe, but the order came down from command, clear and final: surrender. The emperor himself had spoken. The war was over. Japan had lost. Yamamoto heard this news sitting in his barracks, and he felt not grief or shame, but a kind of numb relief. It was finished. The killing could stop. The question of whether to pull the trigger or not was answered. No one would pull any triggers anymore, at least not in this war, not in this particular iteration of humanity's ancient habit of solving problems through violence. He walked outside into the sunlight and saw other pilots standing around in small groups, their faces blank with shock. And he understood that for many of them this was a catastrophe, a betrayal, an ending so terrible they could not process it. They had been taught that surrender was unthinkable, that death was preferable to dishonor, that losing meant losing everything, including their identity as warriors, as men, as Japanese. But Yamamoto felt only exhaustion, bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion. He was tired of flying, tired of killing, tired of maintaining the mental gymnastics required to believe that the men he murdered from the sky were less than human, less deserving of life, less valuable than himself and his comrades. He was tired of carrying the weight of the dead, all of them, Japanese and American, boys who had become statistics, names on lists, memories that would fade as the years passed and the people who loved them died in turn. He was 23 years old. He felt ancient. In the weeks that followed, as the occupation began, as American forces arrived to disarm and demobilize the Japanese military, Yamamoto found himself part of a work detail assigned to help recover bodies from various crash sites around the island. It was grim work, difficult work, but he approached it with the same care he had seen the American POWs demonstrate that day in the jungle. He understood now why they had done what they had done. It was not about honoring the enemy. It was about honoring death itself, about acknowledging that every person who died in a war, regardless of which side they fought for, had been someone, had mattered to someone, had contained a universe of memories and hopes and fears that were now simply gone, erased, annihilated. Treating the dead with respect was not about the dead. They were beyond caring. It was about the living, about maintaining the idea that human life had value, that even in war, even in killing, there could be boundaries,
There could be codes. There could be something that separated soldiers from savages. One day, while working at a crash site, he encountered an American officer overseeing the recovery operations. The officer was older, maybe 40, with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many years of war. They did not share a language, but they shared glances as they worked. Quick looks of acknowledgement, of understanding. At one point, Yamamoto helped lift a stretcher bearing a wrapped body, American from the uniform fragments, and as they set it down with the others, the officer nodded to him, just once, a slight incline of the head that conveyed something that words could not have carried. Respect, perhaps, or recognition, or simply the acknowledgement that they had both survived something terrible and were now on the other side of it, standing in the wreckage, trying to make sense of what had been lost. Yamamoto returned the nod. It was a small gesture. Meaningless, perhaps, in the larger scope of history, in the tally of the dead, in the calculation of victory and defeat. But in that moment, in that single exchange of recognition between two men who had been enemies and were now just men, Yamamoto felt something shift one final time. The hate was gone. The certainty was gone. The simple narratives that made war possible were gone. What remained was more complicated, more painful, but also more true. The understanding that war did not reveal the worst in humanity, so much as it forced the best in humanity to serve the worst ends. That honor and courage and discipline and sacrifice were not enough to make killing righteous, that the capacity for respect and mercy and recognition of the enemy's humanity was not weakness, but perhaps the only thing that kept soldiers from becoming monsters. He went home to Japan eventually, to a country that was broken and rebuilding, to a people who were trying to understand what they had become and what they might yet become. He did not talk about the war. He did not tell stories about his kills or his close calls or his adventures in the sky. He worked. He married. He had children. He lived a quiet life. The kind of life that men who have seen too much often choose. The kind of life that asks nothing except to be allowed to continue, day after day, without drama, without glory, without violence.
But sometimes, on quiet evenings, he would sit and watch the sun set and think about that moment in the jungle, about the American prisoners saluting the Japanese dead, about the crack that had appeared in his certainty, about the terrible gift of seeing the enemy as human. It had not made him happy to learn this lesson. It had not brought him peace. But it had made him true, made him real in a way he had not been before, when he had believed the simple stories and hated with a clear conscience and killed without doubt. The truth was harder to carry than the lie. The truth offered no comfort, no redemption, no easy answers. The truth simply was, war was a tragedy. All of it. Every death, every bomb, every battle, regardless of which side won or who history would judge to have been right. The young men who died in the sky above the Pacific had been human, all of them, and they had deserved to live, all of them, and they had been killed anyway because that was what war was, what war had always been, what war would probably always be until humanity learned a different way or destroyed itself trying. Yamamoto died in 1987, an old man in a country that had become rich and peaceful and carefully forgetful of its past. His children never knew he had been a fighter pilot. His grandchildren never knew he had killed people, that he had been good at it, that for a brief period of his youth he had been a hunter of men and had believed he was doing something noble. The war was something that happened in history books, in old photographs, in the stories of the very old who were mostly too tired to tell them anyway. The world moved on. The tide came in and went out. The sun rose over the Pacific as it had always done, indifferent and beautiful, illuminating waves that held no memory of the men who had fallen into them
or the men who had watched them fall. But sometimes, in the space between sleep and waking, in that liminal moment when the mind has not yet remembered what it is or where it is, Yamamoto would be back in the jungle, watching through binoculars, watching a tall American with hollowed cheeks carefully wrap the remains of a Japanese airman, watching him stand at attention under the merciless sun, watching him render a salute that meant nothing and everything, that honored the dead and acknowledged their humanity and refused to allow war to destroy the idea that even enemies could be worthy of respect. And in that moment, before fully waking, before the walls of his quiet bedroom materialized around him and the sounds of traffic in modern Tokyo reminded him where and when he was, Yamamoto would feel again that terrible crack in his chest, that breaking open of certainty, that unbearable gift of recognition that had transformed him from a warrior who knew who his enemies were into a man who understood that his enemies had never existed, that there had only ever been other men, doing what they believed was right, dying for causes they did not choose, saluting each other's dead because that was the last thing they could control, the last way they could assert that they were human, that they had been human all along, that the war had never changed that fundamental truth, even as it tried with all its mechanized fury to erase it completely. The feeling would fade as he came fully awake, as memory and identity reasserted themselves, as the architecture of his daily life rebuilt itself around him, but the echo remained. It always remained. Some truths once learned cannot be unlearned. Some cracks once opened cannot be sealed, and the knowledge that he had seen the enemy salute his fallen comrades, that he had witnessed mercy and respect in a place where only hate should have been, that he had been changed forever by men who did not know they were changing him, that knowledge lived in him until the day he died, a quiet weight, a permanent wound, a reminder that the hardest battles are never the ones fought in the sky, but the ones fought inside the human heart, where certainty goes to die, and where something more complicated, more painful, but infinitely more true, slowly takes its place.